Well, Bill Kristol, editor-at-large of and founder of the Weekly Standard, political analyst and conservative commentator. Thank you so much for being part of Three Questions today.
Great to be here, Bob.
What brings you to Utah and to Sutherland Institute?
I'm honored to be asked to speak at the annual dinner, and I'm looking forward to doing that. I'm very much in favor of conservative policies at the state level and the federal level, and it's great to have think tanks that are really advancing those policies, thinking them through. We're not having a lot of excellent policy making at the federal level in Washington, D.C. these days. Maybe you noticed that. But at the state level, some good things are happening.
How important is Sutherland Institute in the overall conservative scheme of things?
No, I think it's important, particularly, as I say, because at the national level, there have been disappointments. Obamacare wasn't repealed and replaced. We'll see what happens with tax reform. Otherwise, the policy process is kind of stalled. Education, job training, a ton of issues. What's really happening at the national level? So I think the focus is turning to the state level, where there are some strong governors, some state legislators, some think tanks that are really doing important work. I think conservative ideas remain key for the future. We have a little detour now maybe in Washington with a president who's the Republican, but maybe not really advancing these ideas. Some paralysis in Congress. But the states then remind you that, here in America we can get things done.
I guess all politics is local.
Yeah, right. All politics is local, except there are some politics that are national, and those are a little depressing these days. It's a funny moment, though. You look at some states, Utah is certainly one of them, but there are others, too, where you can say things are happening in a good way, actually. Real policy progress is being made. I don't think you can say that in Washington, though.
You just had breakfast with Mitt Romney, Governor Mitt Romney. What advice did you give him, or what advice did he give you?
Well, I asked him for his sense of where we were nationally. I didn't give him any advice. I think he's been kind of fairly experienced political guy and businessman. Yeah, I think. I don't know that he really needs me to give him any brilliant advice. We talked about the national situation. I think the one thing, he said this very eloquently in 2016 and 2017, we agreed upon, is there are really two parts of successful politics, really, of a successful polity, a successful republic. One is having sound policies. Obviously, if you run the economy badly, if you have bad criminal justice policies and so forth, bad foreign policy, you're going to endanger your well-being. The other is the character of government and the character of society, the culture, the sort of respect for law, the respect for truth. And that, I think, we've taken a bit of a hit on at the national level. And we talked some about that. That's underrated sometimes. People say, well, this policy's good, what's the problem? But you also need to have, the policies can't be sustained if the culture and the overall sense of the community and commitment to certain basic principles and ideals, if that's not there.
Did you solve any problems?
No. But, maybe we laid the groundwork for people solving problems in the future. I don't know.
As you know, he is kind of on the bubble when it comes to running for the Senate. Should Mitt Romney run for the Senate?
Well, that's up to him. I learned long ago that not to really, tell people what to do in terms of running. It's such a personal decision, really. I put it this way. I personally, and I was talking to my wife about this last night, she certainly believes this, and I think a lot of people do. We respect Mitt Romney. We're happy to have his voice in public life, which we have anyway, obviously. But there is a way in which, as a senator, of course, he'd be more front and center. And we need voices like Mitt Romney's. We need principled voices, experienced voices, people who have accomplished things in their life, people who understand what the country is about. So I would be thrilled if Mitt Romney were a U.S. Senator. Having said that, you have a U.S. Senator. There are a lot of other people who might want to, he'll have to make his own decision. So I'm not in the business of telling people to retire or telling other people to run. But I have a high regard for Mitt Romney. And, either way, as a senator or not, obviously I think he'll be a very important participant, as he has been in our public life.
Well, and I was going to ask you this very question. If Mitt Romney runs for the Senate, for Orrin Hatch's seat, and he decides to retire, if Mitt Romney runs for Senate, how would his role in the Republican Party change from where it is now?
I mean, that's a good question, and I think we don't know. There aren't that many instances of someone of Mitt Romney's stature running for the Senate and becoming a freshman senator. So you could say, well, it'd just be one of 50 or 52 or 48, however many there are Republican senators in 2019. So, but I think a former presidential candidate who almost won the presidency, a respected former governor, a real leader of the party and of the country, he would have a unique role, and he might not be the most senior person on this committee or that committee, but his voice would be very substantial and very well respected, obviously, the moment he showed up in the U.S. Senate. So other people have done this. Barry Goldwater, after he lost his presidential election bid in Arizona, ran for the Senate. I think that was the same, his Senate seat was up that year, so he didn't get reelected to the Senate. Mm-hmm. So he then had to run separately again for the Senate. He got reelected and became a very distinguished senator. Others have done that. John Quincy Adams, ages ago, served as president and then went back and was an extremely important voice in the House of Representatives, a great leader of the anti-slavery movement. So I think Mitt Romney could have almost a unique role as an elder statesman, not that elder though, as a middle-aged statesman, I'm going to say, in the United States Senate. So as I get older, my whole criteria of elderly versus middle-aged changes.
Of course, of course. Is there a reason why Mitt Romney ought not to run for the Senate?
Well, I mean, a fair amount of what the Senate does could be, was fairly small ball kind of, and, it's a job, and he's got a kind of freedom now, I think, and I'm sure he loves living out here and not having to commute to Washington and all that. So, and those are all personal decisions. And of course, Senator Hatch is a very distinguished senator, and he'll have to make up his own mind about whether to run again. But I feel that there's a shortage of people of real stature, real experience, real moral leadership in the U.S. Senate. It's not that the others are all bad. It's just that they're people who have been senators for a few years. They're known in their own state. They don't have the kind of national standing that someone like Mitt Romney has. So he would have a chance to say some things and to sort of be a model in a way that most senators don't.
You're one of the most prominent conservative voices in the country. And right now, the Republicans have the House, they have the Senate, they have the White House, arguably the Supreme Court. Why are Republicans so discontent?
Well, a couple of things. They haven't gotten some legislation through they hope to get through. I think there's a very problematic Republican president who a lot of Republicans, and I'm one of them, are not very happy that he's president. And the combination of those two things, as well as maybe some other problems with the Republican leadership in Congress, has created a fair amount of unhappiness. I wouldn't exaggerate the discontent. They're probably happier than having the Democrats in charge. And the country's not doing badly. The economy's pretty good. I think some of the deregulatory efforts of the Trump administration have been pretty successful. We'll see what happens with tax reform. Foreign policy, there's some serious people in there, H.R. McMaster and Jim Mattis and others who I think know what they're doing. I do think that Donald Trump, I'm anti-Trump, so I don't want to look obsessive about it, but he is the president. Presidency is awfully important. And the failure to provide either real moral leadership for the country, I would say, a clear vision, a kind of stability and reliability, and also just the practical failure to be very good at managing the legislative process and so forth. You put all that together, it does create a huge kind of question mark over what does it mean to have the Republican Party in charge. I think if it were a different president and he were sitting down every day with Republican leadership on the Hill and they were working out a strategy and he were traveling abroad and everyone thought, okay, great, he'll do a good job representing the country. If he didn't have a huge turnover in his White House staff and in the cabinet, that would be a pretty different scenario. So I do think Donald Trump has, changes one's view of the party, of conservatism, and really of almost of this well-being of the country.
The Republican Party appears to be in a civil war right now, and you've got the old guard and Mitch McConnell, and you've got folks like Jeff Flake who are peeling off, then you've got the Trump base. Who is going to win this civil war in the GOP?
I don't know. I think it's a genuine battle. There are two or three battles going on at once, so it's a little complicated. There are actual battles on issues, obviously, as a kind of populist nationalist swing, and then the more traditional, you might say, free trade, not so anti-immigration, more internationalist wing. I'm certainly with that wing. There's then just the issue of Trump personally. He's such a disruptive force, and his supporters will say it's a good kind of disruption. But where you stand on that becomes a big issue. So there will be a ton of pride, but I think you're right in this respect. I think people have not, sufficiently internalized or taken seriously the notion what's going to happen in 2018. We're going to have primaries in many states and in many congressional districts between well-financed candidates. Sometimes it'll be a challenger against an incumbent. Sometimes it'll be an open seat or a challenger seat where it'll be two people running for the nomination, maybe more than two sometimes. And it will be kind of the Trump-Bannon wing, you could say, against the more, established wing and traditional wing. And I don't know what happens. We don't have much evidence. This hasn't happened that often. We've had insurgencies of Tea Party candidates. Obviously, you had that here in Utah in 2010 with Mike Lee. In individual states, we've had it on the Democratic side too. But that's usually a few states, and the people who run, maybe they win, then they get kind of assimilated to the party. We haven't had this kind of, as you say, civil war, where the president basically and some of his strongest supporters are on one side, and the Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the House and the former presidential candidates and other former presidents are on the other side. I mean, that's a very unusual situation. I can't really think of a precedent for that in American politics. I think it's pretty important that let's call it the Romney, McCain, McConnell, Ryan forces win. Not that they all agree with each other on everything either, but in this civil war. But it's not obvious what will happen.
Since leaving the Trump administration, Steve Bannon has organized and is now taking aim at various members of Congress for primary defeat, Orrin Hatch being one of them here from Utah. How much of a threat is Steve Bannon to fracturing the GOP?
Yeah, I think Bannon's role personally, I mean, he of course is happy to have it emphasized and highlighted. But look, Bannon wouldn't matter if it weren't for Trump. The people have the sense that Bannon speaks for Trump, and he does sometimes. And there are a lot of Trump supporters who look to Bannon for a cue. They think, well, Trump can't quite say what he thinks because he's president. He's got to get along with these guys. But Bannon's really channeling sort of what Trump and Trumpism are about. So, yeah, I think that's a real threat. I mean, and I don't like it. I don't like that much, Trump and Bannon, but I don't begrudge them. They have a different vision for the party. They want a party that's nationalist and somewhat protectionist and somewhat isolationist and anti-immigrant and, make America great again, whatever that means, but sort of going back to some vision of what America was like, I suppose, in the 50s or something like that. It's a different vision, really, from Mitt Romneys and John McCain's and George W. Bush's, to take the last three Republican presidential candidates. They're entitled to fight for their vision. I mean, I don't like that. I hope they don't win. But I think people are sort of a little too astonished that, Trump spent all of 2015 and 2016 attacking Bush, attacking Romney, attacking McCain, attacking traditional Republican policies in a bunch of areas. And then everyone's surprised that, well, he wants to replace these traditional Republican senators or in open seats, nominate people more like him. He and Bannon are entitled to try what they're trying. I don't really begrudge them that. I think it would be better, honestly, if the establishment types fought back a little more. My problem with the Civil War is not that there's a Civil War. My problem is that only one side is fighting the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And Bannon's fighting, and a lot of other people are kind of hunkering down and hoping it goes away, hoping the waves wash over them and there's no permanent damage. Some very decent people like Jeff Flake have chosen to retire. Again, that's a personal decision, but it's unfortunate in the sense that it seems to look as if one side's fighting and the other side is giving eloquent speeches and then not fighting.
What does the Republican Party stand for now?
I think that's very much up in the air. I mean, I think I could have answered that 2 years ago, and I think I could have answered it for most of the last 30 years, really, since I've been in Washington. And it's an answer I'm comfortable with. I mean, God knows we all made mistakes, but basically a Reaganite internationalism, American strength abroad, American leadership of understanding that we're the core of a liberal world order that has its problems, but is a lot better than the alternative. Free markets and limiting government, constitutionalism, the rule of law at home. So much of our criticism of President Obama was based on those kinds of issues. Trump has very much muddied that, obviously, and again, he has a different vision. And and to be fair to him, it's not like he's concealed that vision much, But I'm more disappointed that in the Republicans who aren't fighting back against Trump than I am surprised that Trump is Trump. He's been the same person for 2 years and articulated the same ideas, such as they are, for 2 years. What has been striking, he won. It was a huge upset. He deserves a lot of credit for winning. I do think an awful lot of Republicans were cowed by that. And a lot of Republicans, to be fair, thought, not unreasonably, well, he's president, we've got to work with him. I'm not against that to some degree, but I think you can work with someone without giving the whole party over to him, without ignoring everything he says and does that really should be criticized. And I think a lot of the Republican members of Congress haven't found the right balance between working with him constructively on policies that they agree with, or modifying those policies, or advising the administration, or working to get good people into government. That's all totally legitimate. But that doesn't mean you have to be quiet when he says things he shouldn't say, or when he pursues policies that are ill-advised.
You opposed Donald Trump all through the election process. How do you explain the fact that a billionaire businessman from New York who had never run for public office, had no political experience whatsoever, is now the leader of the free world?
Look, he ran a very clever campaign. He was lucky in some ways having Jeb Bush as his opponent. I like Jeb Bush, but when people are in a mood for a change, the notion that we're going to have a Bush and a Clinton as the two candidates in 2016, I think that really people just thought, really? I mean, that's our choice. So I think he was helped hugely by being the alternative to Jeb. Then he was helped by the splintering of the field. Then he ran a clever campaign. Then he got lucky in the end, probably with Comey, and drew an electoral college inside straight. So there are a lot of reasons he won, but he won, and he deserves credit for that. You and I can say, he's a billionaire from New York. It's kind of crazy, but he obviously has a certain feel for what parts of America are thinking and feeling and don't feel they can say, and he'll say these things, and he gets credit for, saying things that other people won't say. Some of those things shouldn't be said, honestly. But people want to give him credit. People were pretty fed up after 8 years of President Obama. And what they thought, maybe unfairly, was ineffectual opposition by the Republican Party, and they were frustrated at losing in 2008 and 2012. So he tapped into a lot of things. Look, he's an effective demagogue, is the way I would put it, honestly. And I don't mean that, and I don't like it, but I'm using demagogue more in the political science sense than in a judgment sense.
Mm-hmm.
He is good at seeing, in a pejorative sense, he's good at seeing what's on people's minds, what they're anxious about, what they're unhappy about, and he's willing to poke those things in ways that are sometimes irresponsible. But he did it pretty effectively and continues to do it somewhat effectively. I mean, I wouldn't exaggerate it. He's got a 40% approval rating. He's not winning over a lot of new supporters, but he's holding most of his base, and we'll see how he's holding it with a very strong economy, pretty strong economy, and with no obvious foreign policy failures. I'm pretty dubious that can continue for 3 more years, so just because of the nature of the world. So I'm not so sure he's as strong as people think he is. But he's president, and I won't say he's riding high, but he's riding above somewhat. He's riding along. Let's put it this way. We'll see what happens on tax reform and in various other policy areas, and whether he can. For me, though, the big disappointment is that he has not changed as president at all. I mean, he doesn't seem to have internalized the notion that he's president of the United States, and whatever worked as a celebrity TV guy and, as a candidate even, you don't do that as president. And we pay a real price when the president says and does the things that he's saying and doing.
Should Mitt Romney have run a third time for president?
I don't know. I met with him, I remember, in 2016, and I would have been thrilled if he would have supported him. But again, that's a tough decision to make. And I think he didn't run in the primaries because it looked like all these other young guys. It was their turn, Rubio, Walker, and that was fine with me. I was enthusiastic. I voted for Rubio in Virginia. And then by the time the independent candidacy came along, that possibility was pretty late. It was hard to get on the ballots. You might have looked just like a spoiler. That could have made things worse in the sense of alienating Trump supporters even more. So I very much understand that it was a tough the scenario in 2016 was not really set up well, honestly. And it might have been the right thing to do to just say, look, Trump won the Republican nomination. Let him go ahead and run against Hillary Clinton. Let's see what happens. Going forward, I guess my personal view, and this is really just my view, is Donald Trump. I prefer that Donald Trump not have a second term as president. I don't think he has, the fact nothing he's done as president has changed my mind that he doesn't really have the character and judgment to be president. I hope we avoid too much damage from Trump, and I hope we get some good things done. And I very much admire some of the people working to do that in Congress and especially in the administration. So I don't wish Trump, obviously I wish America well under the Trump presidency, but I would prefer to have 4 rather than 8 years of Donald Trump. I wouldn't really like to have 4 or 8 years of Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or some left-wing Democrat. So I think we could do better than that choice.
Is there a path to the White House for Mitt Romney through the Senate?
I don't know. The only thing I would say is that we're in such uncharted waters. Who would have thought there was a path for Donald Trump, right? So I think the conventional wisdom is, parties always renominate their presidents, and you can look at the economic data and figure out if the presidents can get reelected, and that's worked in the past 2 or 3 presidencies. We've had a kind of normal politics, you might say, for 20, 30, 40 years, but we're now in a very unusual circumstance. I do think Trump, in that respect, Trump also saw that there was a moment here where people were willing to try new things. And if Trump could, do what he's done, a lot of things could happen that people would normally say, oh, no, that couldn't happen.
Yeah, guess what? It happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Has politics changed in this country to the point where the conventional wisdom can no longer be trusted to take an accurate temperature of where the voters are headed and what they really want?
Yeah, I think to some degree. I mean, I just think, I don't know if it's due to new media or whether it's just due to the character of the country and everything happens faster and celebrity matters more. But I think in the old days, maybe you could look at some underlying facts and say this is where things look like they're going to go. And it was a reasonable guess. Conventional wisdom's been wrong in the past as well, but I think now we're just in a much more fluid circumstance. And that's true sometimes. You think of in other walks of life, sports or business or something. There are times when things are kind of well established. There's a team, let's say sports, there's a team, it's on my mind, the World Series just having it. There's a team that's dominant, they clearly have the best pitchers or whatever. They may not win every time, they'll have a kind of bad season, but you can sort of predict they're going to be up here and this other team will be down here. Then there are other times when everything gets mixed up, everyone's got weaknesses and strengths, things are more fluky and depend on someone gets hurt or whatever. I feel like we're at one of those times when it's a very fluid, unpredictable situation in politics. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, good things can come from that because maybe the system needed to be shaken up a little bit. But also, it's a risky time because things can happen that are not so good for the system, for the country, that maybe once would have been checked. I think the celebrity culture, for me, the big thing I missed, people ask me, why'd you get it wrong? You didn't think Trump could win. I think the big thing, I missed a little bit the discontent in middle America. Despite economic growth, it wasn't coming down to them, and the sense that they were losing control of their country and their kids wouldn't have as good prospects as they have. And I think Trump tapped into all that quite effectively, irresponsibly, I would say, but effectively. And that I sort of missed. But the bigger thing I think I missed was just celebrity. That I just thought, well, who's Donald Trump? He's not really well qualified to be president. And as you said earlier, he's a New York billionaire, and can he really speak for these people? And he doesn't have very good character. And so forth. I think I missed the fact that if you've been a host of a star of a reality TV show for 14 years and, in the news for 30 years, you just have people knew who he was. He had a good image in their mind. They were willing to excuse his faults much more than I would have been. And everyone else on the stage looked kind of like, oh, just another politician, a governor, a senator, and here's this time for a change. And that's also what I missed. I mean, the degree to which people were willing to take a risk for change. And I don't begrudge that. There's a lot that needs to be changed in America. There's a lot to be unhappy about. But I remember in the campaign someone saying to me, I said, Trump's really does not have the temperament or character to be president. No, we need to shake things up. We need to really just blow it up in Washington. I said, really? I mean, are things that bad in America in 2016? Yeah, it can't get worse. We just need to really, anything will be better than the status quo. And you really feel like saying, have you read any history? I mean, are you crazy? America in 2016, a lot of things can be worse than that, yeah. Economically, socially, culturally, in terms of political liberties, in terms of the world order. But people just were willing to take that gamble. Maybe we'll see after 4 years with Trump where they are in 2020.
In your recent conversation with former Republican Congressman from Minnesota, Vin Weber, it was pointed out that the stock market is up, unemployment is down, wages are starting to rise, and still 60% of the voters, or 60% of the people out there, think the country is on the wrong track.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I think if the economic comeback really does get to middle America, to working class families over 2 or 3 years, that could change a little. A lot of it is cultural, the sense of family breakup, a sense of uncertainty about the future. A friend of mine pointed out, I really hadn't focused on this, that in 2013, I think, so 2008, there's this huge shock, financial crisis. People really take a hit, value of their homes, people lose jobs. Then we come back, slowly, but we come back, and people have the sense that, okay, we can get back to where we were and resume a kind of upward trajectory. That's why President Obama won re-election in 2012. Just enough people believed that, I think, that he got over the hump, got re-elected with 51%. And then around 2013, 14, people looked at their own incomes, they looked at health insurance costs, they looked at the opioid epidemic in the Midwest and so forth. They looked at what's happening around the world, and the polling shows this, for the first time, people were not confident that their kids would do better than they. And I think that was a moment where, and Trump really kind of, again, saw this in some instinctive way, that people were really concerned about the future. And you could tell them, hey, look, it's not that bad. I mean, you've had some growth in your income perhaps for the last 5 years, and things aren't as terrible as we survived that crash more than we might have expected to. But people really have a sense, I think, a deeper concern about the future. And that's a hard thing to deal with. But that does open people up, I think, to demagogic politicians promising simple answers. Trade's the problem, and coal, we're going to have coal mining is going to come back. And coal mining is not going to come back that much, and we don't really want it to come back, honestly, that much, because cleaner electricity is a good thing, and finding ways to produce electricity to satisfy our electricity needs that doesn't kill a lot of people in coal mines is also a good thing, But of course, if you're in that part of the country and that was the job you had, and your relatives have had those jobs and so forth, you're very susceptible to that promise.
There are those in the Trump base who consider him a brave new leader who is willing to take the heat for doing things that he thinks is right and is not afraid to do things his way. Is he a brave new leader, or is he something else?
I don't think he's particularly brave. I think he is doing things his way. I think he has tapped into a sense that the old way doesn't work very well. Again, I think that's a sort of, he's an effective demagogue, though. And, someone like me stands up and says, well, first of all, the old way wasn't that bad. I mean, America in 2016 is not a failed society, failed experiment in self-government. But people don't want to hear that. They're unhappy. And then if you say, but you know what, incidentally, we have to really work on job training programs and on education and other things, but we can't just snap our fingers, have trade barriers, and bring back, coal mining or steel manufacturing to the Midwest. People say, well, I don't believe that, or they've been saying that for a while. And so the people are susceptible to Trump's promises. I don't think there's much courage there, I wouldn't say. I mean, there's a kind of fake courage of taking on political correctness and all that, but if you're a billionaire and now he's president, I don't think that's extremely, he's not some poor college professor somewhere standing up against an administration to try to teach a class in a politically incorrect way. He's more of a bully, but people do get, they want to believe. People want, this is understandable. People would like to believe the best about their leaders. They'd like to believe that there's some simple solutions. Trump, they'd like to believe that strength will do it, even if it's not strength accompanied by wisdom. And Trump's taking advantage of that, I think.
There are those who say that for Donald Trump, politics is an exercise in transactions as opposed to relationships, which may partially explain how he can attack members of his own party one day and then be trying to sit down to lunch with them the next. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that's right. The art of the deal and all that. And again, sometimes that's legit. I mean, of course, that's what politics is partly about. But that isn't the entirety, in a way, of Trump's vision. Transactions, deals, totally short-term focused. I think you give up a lot in the longer term when you think that way, and including in international politics. You really do want your allies to trust you and you to trust them, and you don't want it all to depend on whether, this particular trade balance this year is great or not. But Trump is a very short-term focused guy, I think.
Why can't Republicans and Democrats get along anymore?
It's a question that people have asked a long time, and there's always a little bit of nostalgia, false nostalgia for past, because I got to Washington in '85, and Reagan and was fighting with the Democrats, and we had Iran-Contra, and we had the Bork fight in '87. So there's been a lot of partisanship and some bitterness, really, for a long time. I do think it's gotten worse. It's due to a whole bunch of things, some of them beyond people's control. I did a little project over the last several months trying to see whether you couldn't have a centrist agenda in certain areas with a guy, Bill Galston, who worked in the Bill Clinton White House. And we actually came up with some policies that I think you could get some consensus on. And I was struck by, and it was nothing special, honestly, this little book we put out, booklet. I was struck by the reaction to it. People really want, I think, some bipartisan cooperation. They see it often at the state level, at the local level. They don't understand why it can never happen at the national level. I think a leader who stood up and said, look, I've got my principles, and there are issues we're just going to disagree on, but I'm going to bend over a little bit backward to try to see if we can't do some things on a bipartisan basis. I think that leader would hit a real chord. Trump weirdly did talk a little bit about that in the campaign. You know, he was not an orthodox Republican. He was a little bit above the parties. He was his own character. I think he missed a huge opportunity when he became president to say, you know what, I'm not going to govern just as a party guy. But he sort of talked himself into now being a very partisan character. All he does is attack Democrats and Hillary Clinton and try to relitigate the 2016 campaign all the time. So I think he's missed that opportunity. I do think there's a younger generation of politicians, younger senators and congressmen, governors, who are interested now in trying to move ahead in a bipartisan way. And maybe that'll be more of that will happen as a reaction to the hyperpartisanship of Washington. And this, again, to come back to where we started off, I mean, someone like Mitt Romney, who's a clear conservative and has real principles, but who actually governed a liberal state and did so quite effectively, working with Democrats at times. I think someone like him coming to Washington really could help not just revitalize conservatism, but also remind people that there are issues we can work across the aisle on, and it's healthy for the country to have some bipartisanship and some comity and respect between the two parties.
Bill Kristol, Weekly Standard, political analyst and conservative commentator. Thank you so much for being part of
Thanks, Bob. It's a real pleasure.